how to use the blur filters in Affinity Photo with shapes. Now I could of course show images, but I'm going to use a shape, a vector shape, and there's quite a few of them. And of course you can create your own vector shapes as well. And I'm going to go with a very basic design at first. I'm going to show later with a star, but of course you could create, like I say, any other different designs with pendles. And of course you could vary the colour. You could also vary the shape itself by maybe combining multiple shapes. Well, where can you find all the blur filters? In the filters menu. And there's a number of settings with each of them. So this one, blur, and I'm going to go through them in order. So average, and that's it. What it does, you notice when as soon as you run it, it will rasterize it. So it's a rasterized shape. It's no longer a vector shape after that. Average really just with a circle just turns it into a square. But you can always go to layer menu and there's a fade command, and you can do this with all of the blurs as well as any other filter. So you can fade it, and you can see the background there. You can fade it 50%. You can also vary the blend mode. So you can set screen, difference, etc. And you can run through those. But you can change the fade, maybe make it 100% or make it 0% or anything in between. But you can create some great designs simply by using the fade option. And do remember to change the fade. Now I'm not going to show the fade for each of the blurs because there's quite a few blurs to go through. So I'm just going to use the history panel just to keep going backwards and forwards between these. So filters menu again and blur. And I'm not going to keep saying filters and blur because otherwise I would keep saying that. So Gaussian blur this time. And again, you get this assistant that pops up. If you just have the rasterizer, once it's been rasterized once, it shouldn't appear. So that's the thing. But you can see with the Gaussian blur, you can blur it quite extreme. So you completely lose the shape near enough. You can virtually. Now, I would find the split very handy, or that split as well, quite handy. So you can see the result of the effect. So the blur sort of smudges it outwards and it fades away to the outer limits for the radius. And you can vary it interactively as well. So that might be easier. And the one thing you notice when you use the slider might only go up to 100 pixels or 300 pixels or whatever, but there'll be a limit. It's 100 pixels, but you can always enter a value 400 or something. So it's not just 100. And then if you put it to 200, virtually lose the image completely. You can just see a red there. But you can, of course, modify the setting by using interactive, and that also goes over the 100. So filters menu, blur, and this time diffuse. Now this one doesn't particularly do much when it comes to a shape. Now, of course, you can use it with images, you can use it with brush strokes, and many, many more. But you'll notice when you do this, it's very, very subtle. And you can modify the settings, and there's very little change. Now, it's quite possible if you've got a different fill, say maybe a gradient fill, that the result may be different. But I'm doing this all with a solid colour, solid shape. Of course, the video could go on for about 2 or 3 hours if you went through everyone with every different type of possible thing. Now, box blur. Now, box blur creates a more like square-like blur. Again, you can split it in the same way there, and you can interactively change the blur radius. So you can keep it very low, so it's a very subtle blur, or you can interactively push it out. And you can see the further you get out, just that point, there is a squareness to that blurring. Like a Gaussian blur, but it's got a blur, a boxy effect. And of course, push it too far, you virtually end up with nothing again. And of course, with all these blurs, what you can do, you can always apply them again. So you can apply them once, twice, 3, 4 times. Also, you can apply them in combination. Now, another thing you can do with blurs, and of course you can't do that with shapes in particular, but you can, if you rasterized it, you could maybe apply a selection to it. Again, filters, blur, and this time motion blur. Now this one's probably more dramatic than any, because what you can do, just zooms up, and you can see the edge of the circle there. You can still see the circle. You can see the circle going as it goes out, so you can see blur. And again, you've got the motion blur. It will go only so far, but interactively, you can drag that out. So it really thins in the center, and you can see still see the circle there in that design. You can rotate it as well. You can see the rotation change. And again, you can split it. But again, let's say you can, of course, apply the blur once, the motion blur. But you can then, of course, once you've applied it, you can apply it again. Or maybe go to the layer menu and use the fade command to fade the effect. And then bring in blending modes into the mix. So that creates a lovely zoom effect. Quite effective. Certain people will disagree and say that this is always the way with lots of these things. You might find that a motion blur in one application is different from a motion blur in another one. And that's good, because you might have 2 or 3 applications and you think, you know what, I want the effect that's in another application. So it's always good that there are actually some variations. I don't think that's it. The rule, this is what it must be. It's like this one. Radial blur. Now the radial blur in Photoshop, those sort of effects that are associated or other applications, may not be the same as this. And you can see with that radial blur, also what you can do, you can change origin point. So you can move that around. So you move that across. Now it doesn't modify the angle. The angle doesn't change in this case. So that isn't the interactive setting. Obviously you can change the angle there. But you can create a nice arc design simply by pushing it to the limit and then just going over and changing the position. But you can create a variety of different lovely radial blur, and you can focus on a certain point, and you can see make hollows in it, or maybe like a donut-like design. And you can go in and out of that. Sadly, there's no video effect in terms of capturing the effect. I would love that feature. That would be brilliant, especially with some of these great filters. To be able to capture that setting and change it. Timeline feature that accepts video. It doesn't exist, but it's on my wish list. And you can see that lovely radius there, that donut design. And you can see it all the way around there. So that's the radial blur. And again, of course, what you can do, obviously it's a shape. You can always rasterize the shape, maybe apply slight blurs, or if you're using a gradient in that fill, the result of that blur may be even more amazing. And of course, what you can do, of course, is maybe have multiple shapes with different gradients and different blending modes and different applications of the radial blur. And you'll be able to create some really beautiful, wonderful multicolored arc designs using that approach. So that's the radial blur. And you can apply it or you can cancel it. I'm just going to cancel it because I want to go on to the next. Otherwise this video will take 3 hours. That'd be ridiculous. Now you go down to zoom blur. Now zoom blur, again, you have the same issue. The slider itself will go to a certain point for the radius. And you can focus the origin, so you can just drag that out. That's the origin point. So you can take the zoom, so it zooms to that point. So if you've got the point there, you can move it around. So it blurs it. And you can see the majority of it, obviously, in that center. And you've got that smudge around the edge there. But the blur is zoomed over to that direction. Or zoom upwards. Or zoom the other way. And so on and so on. And again, you can change the radius. You can weaken it. and you can move it around. So if you want, I say you can. Now you can override that, of course. So you can go over that value of 100. You can set it to 300 or 200. I'm not saying, and you create a more interesting zoom, a more triangular zoom effect. And actually you get a lovely structure in there. You can see. And now, of course, you could vary the shape. So if you've got different shapes, and again, you could fill it with a gradient and different shapes, and you could create all kinds of really wonderful color effects. And then, of course, do it over multiple layers, combine those, create even more amazing colorful effects, which can be moved backwards and forwards. Of course, the thing is about these effects, they're destructive. Now, lens blur is another one. Now, lens blur is an old one with shapes. I mean, there is some effect, of course, but some of the settings have very little change, I have to say. You can move it and it doesn't seem to do much. Change the radius at the top. Now, when you see, you can use interactively, that changes the radius, and you can get this lovely blurring effect. There's a lens blur. And you've got number of blades. Now you can go for 7, you can go for 5, etc. And you can just see subtle changes. So if you go down really low, you can see it more. You can change the curvature there. But if you go with a very low number of blades, you can see more of the structure of the blur. You go further up, obviously you end up, but you can change the bloom threshold. You can see make it a lot lighter there. You can change the bloom factor, and they're all in combination. So bloom factor, threshold, and color will all kick in there. Actually, that one just suddenly jerks as you go over the threshold, and you can modify it. You can see a lovely bloom there, or it just fades away to a light pink. And obviously, if you've got a different color, if you've got a gradient, it's going to be different how it looks. So it's an interesting lens blur. But some, like I say, are very subtle changes. And change the colour again. You can just keep experimenting with it. I always think one thing that I would love to see in these filters would be a randomised feature. So you could sort of random, because obviously if you've got lots and lots of settings, it's nice to be able to, I think, randomise, because sometimes you just don't try them. You don't try all the different settings because there's not enough time in the day to try every possible combination. So a randomise can run through about 20 or 30 different settings. And you think, oh, wow, that setting can do this or that, and maybe have a preset as well. Sadly, there isn't. Okay, next one. But that one was pretty good, lens blur. Now I'm just going to go down to, whoops, where'd you get there? Sometimes the menu just suddenly disappears. Depth of field. Now this one's an interesting one as well. You've got a couple of features in this, and again, this has got a lovely mode. So you've got elliptical and you've got tilt. I'll show you that a little bit later. But the radius, so the blur will blur outside. So the bit in the center is not blurred. As soon as you get out to the outer bit, that middle bit, that's obviously the blur, and you've got like a gradient of blur. But beyond that, the blur is consistent. And you can, of course, vary the size. You can move the origin point as well, so you can move around to maybe focus on a particular point on that shape. So you can make it very tight. So basically, the whole thing's blurred in, so maybe push the outer one really, but it's a gradient in between. That inner bit from there to there. So the outer to the inner. Once you get it right. So you can see the blur effect. So once you've gone past the actual outer blur, you can see it's the same all the way around. And you can vary the clarity, which doesn't seem to have much effect with shapes. And obviously you can affect the radius and vibrance. Now this, of course, vibrance and clarity and things probably have more effect if you've got an image or something that's got a bit more colour in it, or variety of colour, than just something that's just bright red. So you're obviously not going to have much there. And again, like I say, you can move it around and you can create some very sharp points. Now, of course, as with all these things, you can go to the layer menu and you can fade it. So you can create some interesting combinations, say like darken or difference, or we'll change the fade strength. And of course, once you've done it, once you've applied it, you can always apply it again. Now, what you can also do, of course, is maybe create two shapes. So you've got two layer shapes, and then apply different blurs to each of them to create different blurring effects. So you could maybe have the blur sharp at one point and sharp at another point, and then use blending modes to maybe combine them in different ways. And again, it could vary, of course, depending if you've got gradients instead of just a solid colour. And you've got go down, oops, I wanted to show tilt. Forgot tilt. Well, tilt. There is another option there, mode. Change radius. So now go up to tilt. And it's very similar in many ways. Again, you've still got that region. This works on the same principle. So you've got that central core that has no blurring. You can make that as narrow or as wide as you want. But outside of that, you've got this band that then has the blur. And that blur, so you've got the middle bit and the other band. That blur goes all the way out. But it's a gradient effect. So it blurs really intense at the far end. But now if I shrink it, once you hit that point, once you've gone beyond the blur, outside that range, the blur's consistent. I'm certain someone will turn around and say, no, that's not how it works. But that's the way I perceive it working. Certainly visually it looks that way. Maybe the maths is different. I don't know. But certainly that's what I think the approach of this tool, how it works. And you can rotate it as well. So you can create some very interesting, sharp focuses. Say you've got some text in the center. Obviously I haven't here, I've got shape, but you could have some text and you can blur it so you get the edges sort of suddenly blur out, whereas the center bit of the text is still visible. Maybe you could duplicate the text. So you could have the blurring effect applied to one, and you still have the very sharp text above. And then you can, of course, group them so they're combined. And then we'll use blending modes, and so on and so on. There's loads of different things you can do. Move them around subtly. And you can do the same like this blur, and you can apply this tilt blur twice or 3 times to create different combinations of blurring effects. And you can, like I say, rotate around to create some weird sort of spray as it goes outwards from that initial point. So let's go to the next one. And it's getting quite low now. Field blur. And you change to the global radius, as it's called there, instead of just radius. More a Gaussian effect there, personally. And you can change the selected handle level. It's a change, definite changes. The selected handle power. It's truly with shape, very subtle, if there is any change. Personally, I can't see much. So there are some filters, and I will say that, again, as with all these, if you're using an image, you might find that the result will be more powerful and more effect. Again, you could be using like a selection with an image and so on and so on to create some really interesting effects. But with a shape, it doesn't have such power, as it's a sharp object in the first place. Maximum blur. Now this one is an interesting one, in that it just turns it into basically a rounded rectangle, square. And you can vary the radius. You can actually push it again beyond that 100, so you can make it 400, and it definitely makes it a square. Fills the whole entire screen. And you've also got an option for circular as well. And that basically makes it more circular than a rounded rectangle. But of course, again, this does depend on the shape. And of course, if you've got a more complex design, maybe a more complex shape, maybe made up of multiple different shapes, then the result will be more effective than just this effect. But it just basically pushes it out to the limit. Just solid blur. There's no blurring in a sense. The blur is just solid. And you can see the circular effect there. It's not particularly most elegant of circles, I have to say, the result, but it's a circular effect. Blur and minimum, strange enough, does the opposite, shrinks it. It's like the Ant-Man of so you can, but it shrinks it, not in a way of making it a circle still. Even I think even the circular one doesn't do that. But you get this weird sort of diamond-like bulging diamond design, and you can make it fade away by increasing the value. And again, if you varied the shape, if you've got a more complex shape, maybe a star design or maybe multiple shapes, the result will be more effective and more dramatic. You can, like say, fade it in circular. So it's, again, with a circle, it's very subtle, the difference. So on to the last batch of down here. I'm not certain why they're split, but I suppose there's a mathematical reason. Bilateral. And you can see in this one, it's a sort of interior blur, where you've got the blurring going inside as you change the radius setting. And again, the radius, you can change the tolerance, so you can push the tolerance up. If you push the tolerance always down, basically you can see it's red, the solid colour that it was before. Again, this would be varied if you've got maybe a gradient or something different. So you can see the tolerance there. And you can, of course, push it up to 100%, that's it. But the radius, you can increase, push that all those up. And you can also interactively change it as well. And move it around if you wish. And you can push it over the limit. Even off the image itself. And it takes a few seconds to react. So you get this completely sort of hazy end result. And of course, what you can do, you can always apply it multiple times. Like all filters. They sometimes work best if you apply them a couple of times, 3 or 4 times. So you can see you end up with a very faded sort of blur, but it's an interesting blur effect all the same. And again, you could use this type or other images, of course. And just going back to the basic shape. So you can go to filters. Now in another video, I'm going to do the layers, live filter layers. But in this case, I'm just doing filters. And they're interesting in their own way as well. Now medium blur is a bit like the minimum. There's not many settings, again radius, and you can just, it's actually very hard to control actually. It's slightly, just drag it and suddenly disappears. So it's a subtle, and maybe best to actually control it via the value itself, radius setting, instead of interactively. But again, this might vary depending on thing. But it just obviously is an averaging out tool, medium. That's my understanding of median anyway. Filters, and now the blur, and go down to the last one, custom blur. Now this one, sadly, is a very powerful one, but probably the least flexible in the sense that there's no presets. It'd be really nice for those presets, and also a randomize feature, so you could randomize them, and also maybe a lock feature where if you entered 12 in one place, 12 is entered all the other slots, because it takes a bit of time to enter -12, -12, -12. It's not the quickest. And you can change the divisor there and the offset, and you can obviously make it normalized so you can't access the divisor. So it does that for you. But you can enter values and you can try it. And sometimes like combinations of -2 all the way around and 5 in the center will have a different result. And you can create these sort of like weird blurred out hollows effects. And you can vary them and trial and experiment. It is such a pity it doesn't have a preset feature. Without that, of course, you can create all these things, takes a bit of time to do, and then, of course, you lose it. So it could be more fun, to be honest. I am certain it is quite a powerful filter, but it's one of those filters, I have to say, I wouldn't regularly rush to. So that's the custom blur. But what you can do now, I'm going to show slight change there. Instead of using just ellipse and things, obviously I've got that ellipse there. I'm now going to use a star shape. I'm going to use the standard 5-point star initially, and then I'll show you with obviously more points than that. But of course you could use other shapes as well as combinations of shapes. So 2 or 3 layers. Created the star via the star tool. The star shape, of course, as with the circle, can be modified by other effects such as deform, and then apply the blurs to create more designs. But you see, straight away, some of these blurs can be really quite effective, and by changing the origin point and obviously have an extreme radius, you can create some really quite abstract designs using the zoom blur. And of course you can apply it more than once. Also there's other blurs, of course. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can use box blur, you can use radial blur, and that creates some really beautiful, lovely, and you can still see the star through there, but you can see by that radius you can create some very abstract ring designs. You can change the radius, of course. You can push it to the max. You can push it beyond that, of course. And of course, what you can do, you've got that design there, a ring design just from a star. And of course, you could apply it multiple times. Maybe create multiple layers of stars, multiple rings, use different blending modes and combine them. I better remove that because that's been rasterized, so it doesn't change the value. So I'm just going to quickly add a new star. Now this star has 25 points. And of course what you can do, you can go back and use exactly the same blurs as before. Maybe zoom blur. But there's the radial one. And radial one, you can see now you can create some very interesting ring designs. You can see that sort of ring effect, and you got some transparency as well. So you can use that with the layers panel and effects. And also you can combine the different shapes as well with that transparency. And there's many more things you can do with these. Hope you found this tutorial of interest. Please subscribe to the Graphicxtras channel. Always adding new tutorials about Photoshop, Affinity Photo, Illustrator and many others. Please add some comments, always appreciated. A dislike or a like. Thank you much.